All right, cool. All right, how's everybody doing? Good, cool. So my name is Josh Lynch, and I wanted to come up here and talk to you guys about how I made Substance Designer materials for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. So first of all, I want to say thanks for Infinity Ward, for letting me come up here and share these materials. And for this session, we're going to be discussing creating materials for Infinite Warfare, why and how Substance Designer was used, and just general material creation strategies. So the talk is going to be, the first half is basically like high-level material creation stuff, and then we'll get into Substance Designer at the end. Yep. And then at the end, I'll be available for QA if you have any questions. So why did we use Substance Designer for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare? The project needs were, we had a large library of older photo source content that we needed to be updated. We needed the ability to work with other teams and existing pipelines and produce content for both world art and the vehicle and ship teams. And as far as the artistic goals, we had locations including Earth, other planets, and going to space meant a wide variety of materials, material types that needed to be created. And there was a lot of content that you just couldn't go out and scan, right? So we needed to have a tool that would allow us to make all the cool stuff that was in the concept art. And then we have awesome pipeline flexibility. So again, it's not a lot of work to get content into the game. And an artist could work from start to finish in Designer or bring in an external normal or height map to start. So like I mentioned before, we had a lot of existing content, and we would throw in the existing normal and height maps and just clean it up from there. And the biggest thing is a lot of the other content was being made with Quixel Suite, right? So we needed a tool that would allow us to have everything sit well in the scene, right? So Substance Designer allowed us to do that. So some of the benefits of Substance Designer, it's the speed and usability. You can get rough ideas into game very quickly. So when I was working, oftentimes I would get a task and I would sit with the map leads and we would just throw stuff in really quick to see if it worked. We didn't take time to take it to finish. We just wanted to see if the idea would even work. And then if it didn't, we didn't spend a lot of time sculpting. We would just get something in really rough and then move on. It's highly iterative and completely non-destructive. So we get great results with out-of-the-box nodes. And that's one thing I really want to stress is you don't have to make everything with effects maps. You totally can. But if that's intimidating, you can get good stuff going with just the nodes that are there. And then we have an unparalleled amount of reuse. So we could take, file like nodes from one file and bring it over really quickly. It was awesome. And a good amount of consistency. We had a clean creation process of the height and normal first. And good noise control. And the albedo was authored with any lighting information, so it's super clean. So some simple art direction notes. These are really high level. But we wanted a grounded world, right? So this meant no typical sci-fi tropes. We weren't taking every corner and beveling it at 45 degrees. Everything had to have a realistic feel in its construction. And we wanted everything to have like a really good visual DNA and cohesion. So the gamer should feel like they're in a unique and curated world, right? So we want each level to feel really good and special. And they should sit well in the scene, right? So nothing should feel jarring or out of place. So for example, you don't want to have cobblestone on a spaceship and that kind of stuff. So some of the considerations when authoring materials for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare are that the game, it's an FPS, right? So it's action-packed. It's not Tomb Raider. You're not standing around and looking. So there's a lot of running around and there's a lot of action, not a lot of pausing and looking around. And the interior to the Retribution was one of the exceptions to this rule outside of like the cinematic moments that were heavy on dialogue. So what does this mean? So we wanted all the materials to be easily identifiable at a glance. We didn't spend a lot of time putting a ton of detail because you just wouldn't see it, right? You're running around and it needed to run at 60 FPS, so we didn't have like the craziest texel density. And so we wanted focused detail, simple albedos, and we put all the detail into the gloss, so when the light would roll across the surface, it felt really good. And then eye rest. So I can't stress this enough. There's, like I wrote up there, there's beauty and restraint, but sometimes it's good to not have a lot of noise, or to only have the noise in the normal map and not in the color. So if you look in, I don't know if you can see my mouse. So if you look into this shot, it feels like you can look into it, right? It's not visually jarring for you to look at. You can look into it and find things. So it's really important that the materials helped with that. So here's another shot where I feel like that holds true. Most of the colors in here are very simple. The details in the gloss and the normal map, and it's just easy to look at. There's another shot that shows the same thing. One thing we wanted to do is have simple yet flexible materials. So when working on COD, sometimes you would make something that's like you intended to be like a floor panel, but it gets thrown on the wall or a ceiling. So you don't want to put a lot of layering into the surface. So what that means is, like, you don't want to put in a lot of like pebbles into the texture that may come in via a blend or a decal later on. Sorry, I got a little bit ahead there. So we wanted to maximize potential within each texture, right? So it's advantageous to try to build textures that could have multiple purposes and use cases. So again, ability to be on a floor, wall, or ceiling when appropriate. And this is one example of a blended texture here. So if I jump ahead, you can see that this is the rubber material, and then this is the frost. And then that's them like combined together, right? So on their own, they look relatively simple, but when they're put together, they feel really good. So here's another shot with some blended materials. This is an asphalt blend with water on it. So again, here's the asphalt blend material, and then these are the two asphalts that make that up. So I get a lot of questions about how do I work in production, and so I wanted to go over that briefly. When I get a task or assignment, the first thing I do is, if there isn't already any reference, I do some reference gathering. So I gather as much reference as I can. And the reason I do that is ideas can come from all over the place, right? I want to have a good amount of planning in there, so I create a plan of attack based on gathered reference and a discussion with my lead. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we test early and often in game, so working in a vacuum is not ideal. Sometimes you could spend 2 days on something and it just doesn't work, so I find it better to get it in there early and often. And then communication, like you want to talk with other artists and be open to feedback and iteration. So basically be flexible yourself as an artist. So inspiration from real world reference. A lot of time is spent looking at real world and military reference when creating art for the Call of Duty universe. Creating materials is no exception. Every material made is inspired or based on or inspired by real life reference. And each material is grounded in physically accurate material properties. So this is the reference. This is what we came up with. So we just try not to copy it like one for one. I try to add some personality to it and be inspired by the reference. Another thing I want to talk about is a macro to micro mindset. So I feel like this really is important when making textures. Oftentimes I see artists working on a texture and they go to noise like right away. So I wanted to talk about this real quick. So what I mean by macro to micro mindset is details should be easily digested and readable from far away all the way to a close-up read. Far, medium, and close-up reads should all offer some level of interest. And so how is this helpful, right? It can help you with organization, give a solid place to start and focus, and reduce stress. It's like building a house or a prop or a character. You start big and work small. Saving the smallest detail for last can help with controlling the amount of noise. So a quick example run through of this. If I'm looking at this reference here, I'm pulling inspiration for the macro read. I often refer to this as the thumbnail read. At this distance, details like the pattern or major forms of a surface are visible. The basic color palette comes into play, and for this specific reference, you can start to see that there's tilt in the stones, right? And so at a medium read, you start to see more variety in life. This is where you will start to see surface details such as undulation or damage, and you have indications of local color variety. And then for micro read, this is usually when you're like right here on a texture or you're standing right on top of it. The fine surfaces such as bumps of paint, grains of sand, or details of cloth, or like all these pebbles and debris are in here. So here's a run through of like the normal map creation with this mindset. So I start off with the basic pattern, simple edge bevel and line weight variety between the stones. Then I start to introduce edge chipping and the tile tilt and medium level surface detail. And then the final pass is like gum and pebbles and that kind of stuff. So same thing with the color here. I start off with mostly flat colors, hue and value breakup, subtle amounts of noise. And then I do another pass, I add some dirt. And then the final pass is all the detail. So like surface undulation and rocks and gum are added in there. Okay, so moving on to material creation strategies. So I'm going to use the cobblestone here as an example. We talk about reference, making surfaces that feel alive. We'll talk about height normal maps, gloss roughness, and albedo and ambient occlusion. So again, I mentioned this, but I take a lot of inspiration from real world reference. I'm always looking at my reference. I don't try to make anything up. And I try to understand how materials react to light as well as how they look in shadow or overcast lighting. So I feel like this gives you a solid baseline for your visual target and believability. And then, like I mentioned just a little bit ago, don't make something up because it won't feel natural. Everybody knows what concrete looks like, what brick looks like. So if we're looking at this as reference as an example and breaking it down, I often ask myself, what is the material type? Is it man-made, natural, or organic? What's the climate location of the material? Is it an arid or wetland, indoor, outdoor, wall or ground? It's those types of things play a big role in like the aging of the surface and where it lives. So the big read items are pattern, color palette, and then as we move on, there's story and history identifiers. Is it old or new? Is there stains or drips? Is it heavily trafficked? And then again, local color variety, noise amounts and variation. And does it have like, it has like loose rocks and debris in this shot. So for the height and normal map strategies, I always make this stuff first. I feel like depends on the type of material, but this is really important when you're trying to create any material. You want this to be first. So the foundation material, strong foundation is key. And without these maps, the albedo and gloss or roughness maps are not going to shine, right? Like these are the things that make it tick. Another thing I want to mention is you don't want to make the normal map look too intense because everything will look dark and self-shadowed. I'll go over that later when I'm in one of the files. And so for gloss and roughness, the main thing here is it controls the light response of the surface. Surfaces that have tide highlights tend to reflect more of the world around it, and matte surfaces have a broad highlight with little reflection of the world around it. I feel like it's a good idea to establish basic material separation and properties early on to start to give the material some life. And a lot of time should be spent on the gloss and roughness map. So what I mean here is, if I were to quantify it, I would say probably, I try to spend at least half the time because I feel like getting the light response is really important. And then depending on the surface type, this map is arguably as important, if not more important than the normal map. I would say that anyway. So as far as albedos go, simple albedos provide the best results. Using simple colors as a base is ideal, like I showed that macro to micro breakdown. Keeping colors in line with reference material is good. Don't bake lighting information into the albedo. It's good to trust the shader and the lighting. Like it's okay if your albedo is relatively simple looking. It's more important to look at the material as a whole and how it's sitting in the scene than it is to try to focus on the albedo itself and put a ton of detail in there. So quality albedo maps can take time to create in Substance Designer. There is no one node to make your albedo look great. Photoshop workflows apply inside of Substance Designer, and that's exactly how I still work. So I feel like effective layering and decision making helps to create believability and improve overall quality. And then I use a lot of masks generated from curvature and AO maps to create believable details. And as far as ambient occlusion goes, these are essential maps for selling depth in a material. They're typically on their own or packed into a channel, depending on your shader. If for whatever reason you don't have a dedicated ambient occlusion map in your shader, it's okay to use it like as a mask and put dirt in there to help sell that depth. It's like that way you're not actually baking in lighting information, but you're giving a sense of depth and story there. So this is a breakdown shot of the cobblestone. So on the left it's the height, normal, and AO. And then you add the glass, or not glass, the gloss, and then the albedo. So I feel like this shot was important to kind of finalize everything I just said. So for me, there's a few key ways to making surfaces feel alive. You want to bend the light. So what I mean when I say that is you want to add slope to the normal map, then it will make the surface feel more alive and organic by bending the light. So if you look at this shot here, it's subtle, but none of these planks are all facing the same direction. They're slightly bent. So as the light's falling down the surface, you can see it's shifting from left to right as it fades off. So there's a fingernail test. I oftentimes ask myself, like, how does it look like it would feel if I scraped my fingernail across the surface? Like, is it smooth or rough? And another thing I want to talk about is the tail of the light. So I really tried, like I mentioned it a few times already, but I feel like it's really important to treat the gloss with a good amount of attention, as it's what's going to bring a lot of interest when the light rolls across the surface, right? So when you're looking at the tail of the light, it's not just like going from the center outward and it just is an even fall off. You want a bit of like noise in there. It's going to make it feel lived in and like there's smudges on top or some scratches. And then simple albedos, they keep eye rest when the light is not hitting the surface. So if you look here, it feels relatively simple, and to me that's a good thing. You don't want it to be like as detailed as the gloss. So when your light rolls across it, if the albedo is already really busy, then the gloss is it's not going to feel impactful. All right, so thanks for taking the time, and I hope this was informative. I'm going to get into a material breakdown now of a rubber floor material. And any Q&A you guys have, please ask me after the surface breakdown. I'd love to answer any of your questions. All right, let's get into the good stuff. So as I mentioned in the PowerPoint, I typically work macro to micro. So I want to go over what that means as far as what it meant for this rubber material here, and just kind of go through the nodes. And if you guys have any questions when I'm done, like, hey, I want you to go over that part a little bit more, or just ask me. I'd be happy to go over it with you. So typically when I start, I have I think of it like if I'm in like Maya or Max or ZBrush, you have a plane, and I think of that plane as like 50% gray. And then anything I do above or below is going more to white or more to black. But I find for me anyway, it's really beneficial to work from a flat gray, like a middle gray, at like around 50%, and then go up or down. So I always start with a uniform color, and I make it, by default it's 8-bit, so I make it 16-bit. That helps with later on down the chain. If you don't have 16-bit all the way through, you're going to get a lot of nasty stair stepping in your normal map. So when I was working on this rubber floor material here, let me switch this to flat gray so you guys can see this a bit better. All right. Okay. So when I'm making materials for, or when I was making materials for Call of Duty, I mentioned in the talk about making them have like a multiple use cases, right? So this is it's meant to be like a walkway kind of path texture, but it could be used on like a wall or a ceiling, but the intent was a walkway. So what that meant was, if we look at it like from this perspective, it's pretty clear that it's a path, right? I have this bar in the middle that is visually going to pull the player through and guide them along. And then on the edges here, I dropped in some notches. So if this were to bump up against a wall or a trim, it's going to make it feel visually like those notches are there as like they were bolted down underneath, and then this plastic piece was popped over to cover it. So I'm trying to provide some visual interest and like narrative in that way. And then if the artist ever wanted to just have half of the texture map, they could just cut it right down the middle. So all those things are going through my mind like when I'm making this stuff, or when I was making this stuff. So going back, I start really big, right? So if I'm looking at this height map, I just drop in these larger panels first. And I do that by creating like a tile sampler. Let me get all these rolled open here. And then I use, I get a multi-value grayscale map out of that, and then I run this edge detect, and it's very thin, but it basically gives me the initial separation of the panels. And then I use a bevel map, or bevel node, sorry, and then I add it to the blend here as a multiply, and that's giving me my initial kind of depth, okay? So if it helps, what I can do is just bring this to the end real quick. So you can see it's just very simple, right? Like there's nothing to it. But as I go on, I just layer on the detail. So this next part here is like a macro undulation. So the ribbing on here, you can't really see it too well. But if I were to remove the ribbing, there's a good amount of movement in the surface, and I want it to feel like it's walked on a bunch, right? Like it's starting to bow and give weight to the heavy traffic that's happened over time. And so what I do there is I just usually take like a Perlin noise zoom. I run it through a transform 2D, and I skew it out to the side, and that breaks the tiling. So to fix that, I run it through a make it tile photo. And then I just did some levels adjustments and a slight blur. And in order to make sure that each panel feels unique from the next, I run it through a directional warp, and what's driving the directional warp is this multi-value grayscale map. So it shifts everything, so it's not all like, it doesn't look like I took a noise and just did an overlay. I'm trying to make each area look unique. And then I just do an add sub on that to give that undulation. And here, I'm just giving it a slight blur, okay? So let me get in here and you can see what's going on. So I have this height map, right? Let me do this. And I know that I'm wanting to drop in these kind of panel notch details here. So if we look at it, oh, my bad. It's already doing it. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm running this blur, okay? And what I'm trying to get here is I'm trying to make it feel like the edge of my ribbed rubber here is rounded, but where these panels are, these notches, it's harder surface, right? So what I do is I have this mask and I run it into the blend, and I'm blurring where it's white. So where the notches are, it's not blurred. So I'm able to hold like a tighter edge detail there, and then where it's on the edge of the panel, it's rounded. And then here I have like a little line that I've carved out, and I'm just giving an indication of separation there. And how I made that was I took this polygon shape. I did we had a node at IW called Simple Transform, and I just skewed it like that, and then I blurred it, and I used a gradient map to clamp the values back down to keep a tighter edge. Then I just ran it through a tile sampler, and I just placed them here, and then I used a Simple Transform to offset it, so I kept them at the edges. So that's how I got this thin edge line. So I ran that through a gradient with black on the edges and white in the middle, and I blurred it slightly, and then I inverted it, and I set it to a multiply. That's how I got the line carved. And then here is my notch raises. So I have that detail from the setup. I run it through a bevel to give it a little bit of a depth, and then it just kind of pops it up just a little bit. And so here's the ribbing, okay? So the ribbing is, I use the tile sampler a lot. I love the node. So I just have a Y amount that felt good. There was no magic number. I just ended up on 80. And I have this mask map input here, and I'm plugging that in, so I'm saying where it's black, don't populate any of the lines. And so one thing I try to do whenever I have a bunch of data like this, like a bunch of lines, I don't want it to feel like it's really straight or modeled, or like it's just an end-do line where it's just perfectly like just always like it doesn't look like it's lived in. So what I try to do is I have two bevels, and they're doing different things, and then I run it through a blend with this moisture noise. And if you look, I don't even know if you guys can tell. Yeah, it's kind of it's kind of hard to see, but what I'm doing is I'm just giving a feeling of like it's more organic, and it doesn't feel so perfectly CG. So I think if I take that out, let me see what happens. Yeah, you can see the lines. They kind of just shift a bit. So to me, it's all this subtle layering and attention to detail that really makes things feel lived in. And yeah, I just blur it, and then I do a subtle warp. Again, I'm trying to break all the straightness of the lines, and I use a directional warp here, or just a warp with a Perlin noise zoom, and it just shifts it ever so slightly. So another thing that I did on this texture was I wanted to give like all these little surface nicks here. So I wanted it to feel lived in, right, and worn and old. And I just used a tile sampler with a crescent shape. So if I recreate this real quick, let me show you kind of what's going on. So if you bring in a tile sampler from scratch, and I just bring in, where is it? Crescent. It looks like this. But if I offset this just a bit so you can see what's happening. And if I come up here to pattern specific, I can clamp it down. And then if I take this size down, I get these really thin lines. But what's great about it is, just to kind of go back here, if I scale these up, I get this nice fall off on either side of it, right? So in the peak or in the middle, it feels like it's the deepest, and then on the edges it tapers out, so it looked like something really hit, was narrow, went deep, and then came back out. So that's the kind of look I was going for. And then I just used an auto levels here to bring it up to full white. And then I have a mask from the ribbing, and I use that to keep the scratches just at the peak. So when you scratch something, it doesn't go down into the groove, right? It just stays at the top. So I wanted to sell that narrative visually there. And again, I'm using this mask to prevent any of the surface damage from touching the notches at the end here. So you can see they look very like clean and plastic-like compared to all this pitting in the rubber. And then the next thing I do is I have a subtle noise. So if I take this out, it feels kind of it doesn't feel, I don't know, it feels like plastic. So as soon as I add that noise in, it starts to give it that feel of rubber, like if you push it, it's squishy. And then this is just some more subtle surface damage. And again, I'm using this multi-value grayscale map to shift the noise around, so each panel has a different look. And then I'm isolating it again to the peaks of the ribbing. And then what's this guy doing here? Oh, and then I'm removing the notches from it. And then I noticed that in the reference I had, there was all this, I'm sure you see it like in your car too, like where you're like after like 6 months and you haven't washed your car, you like get all this like nasty stuff like collecting in the grooves of the mat. So that's just what this is. It's little pieces that, like, I don't know what it is. It could be rocks, it could be whatever. I just wanted to have a little bit of attention to detail there to make it feel lived in, but keeping it kind of nondescript. So this is where the normal map ended up. So if you look at it, like at the end here with the height map, it's not going like full white to full black. I mentioned that middle gray. So like if I looked at it from a profile, it's feeling fairly, there's not a lot of depth there, right? So it's okay that the height map doesn't go like full white to black. And then my normal map here, I kept the strength at like 14. So I wanted to talk with you guys about, so like I mentioned in the PowerPoint, not having it get like super strong. So if I type in like 50, it just looks like this is like crazy pink and purple, and it's harsh looking in and of itself. And then when the light, like if I turn the scale off, the light isn't like traveling across the surface very well. So if I undo back to that, you can see that the light tends to flow across the surface a little easier. And then as far as the roughness goes, it's pretty simple. Like again, I start off with basic colors, right? So like I have one value here and one value for the notches. And then I add a subtle amount of interest here from the curvature. So I make my curvature from the normal map, and then I have the curvature and curvature smooth. And I just combine them here with an add sub. And that's how I tend to start off my gloss or my roughness maps, is I get solid colors and then I throw that type of thing on right away. And then I wanted a level of grime here, right? And I have this clouds, black and white spots, and then I throw on like a directional warp. And I really like this result here because from a big read, there's a lot of noise, but there's like black and white and gray. And then as you zoom in, you start to get in this like per pixel variation. And then I just use the levels to clamp that down. And then again, I shift it with the directional warp to keep it isolated per panel. And then I just do an add sub. So I'm just trying to add like a layer of lived in grime. And then this stuff here is isolated into the grooves, so it's giving the feeling of like dust collecting. And then it's another layer of grime here that's really like caked in. And then this pass here is really isolated to that damage. So I just have a mask from the black and white data that I had before, and I'm just overlaying that into the gloss. And then this area here is for the flecks, so I wanted them to feel bright and catch as the light's rolling across. And then I did a levels at the end just to kind of clamp it down. So to go over the albedo pretty quickly, it's the same thing. I did just some solid colors, and then I add a layer for dust. And some subtle information in here from the curvature. So I don't look at this like I'm baking in lighting information. I look at it like as rubber is wearing down, it tends to discolor, right? It doesn't stay really dark, it gets brighter. Some rubbers do anyway. And this is just the color variety for the really recessed caked in dirt. And then this is the dirt for the pits. So again, for this grime, I just did this type of workflow again, and then I have some colors here that I sampled from scan data, and I just plugged them in. And same thing here, I have this kind of really cool damage, and then I just have a gradient, and I just sampled those colors and just plugged them in. So one thing I really like about the gradient map is, by default, it's kind of just that, but if you drop in a few keys and you take the black here and you take the alpha to 0 and you make that red, you're removing, like you're giving it transparency, but as it's fading out to nothing, you're able to shift that color. So if I take, let's see, this and I make this green, and then this inside one, I make it like pink. So just from that black and white data, I'm able to introduce multiple types or hues and values, right, as it's going from white to black. So it's really cool to leverage the gradient map in here and take advantage of that. So that's how I got this to feel really like it's really in there, and then this is fading off to nothing. And then this last part is just the fleck for the color. So if I plug that in, you can see that, I mean, really, without the color, you could still know what the material is, and that's kind of what I'm trying to say is, the color is important, but it's not the most important thing. Your height, your normal, your gloss, your roughness, your AO are all really important. And when I authored this originally, we didn't have the new AO node, but since I came up here and I'm like in the file again, I added that, and it's probably one of the best additions in a long time to the program. It feels really good, and I'm able to accurately represent my height map now in my ambient occlusion without going through and doing the old setup where I took the curvature and I combined a bunch of things.